ITSM to allow the management of governance, risk and compliance. My name is David Pickering. I work in the product marketing team within Avanti, and I'm going to be running the session for you today. Before we get started, let's just look at some housekeeping we want to run through. First thing is this presentation will be available to download at a later point in time, and that will be within your resources and hyperlinks, and you'll get an email from us indicating where you can go and view the recorded demo of this. So we are recording the webinar, so you can pass that to other people to look at, or you can review that later in your own time. We do have the ability to answer questions, so if you do the Q&A, we'll have the ability for you to go and ask questions of myself as we go through, and you think of something, please throw it in the question and answer box, and we'll get to answering that at the end of the session. We're going to keep this short, 30 minutes or less. We want to make sure this is short and sharp, gives you the key information that you want to look at from a point of view of governance, risk and compliance that sits within Avanti Neurons for ITSM. And I hope that you enjoy the session. But before we get too excited and jump into what GRC is, really interested to understand from you, the audience, that ask you a poll question. And that poll question is a fairly simple one. You can answer this, select multiple if I'm right. How do you currently manage against your governance, risk and compliance? Do you just use a spreadsheet? Do you just write it down on a piece of paper? A third-party solution, so you've already got something in play that you're using, or some other means of doing it, or maybe you just don't do anything. You don't have no capability currently to manage your governance, risk and compliance. So I just want to give you a few seconds to just think about that, and we'll get to the poll and see how you go about doing your governance, risk and compliance. So let's go and see how the results are going. So most people are doing it in a spreadsheet, and that's not too surprising from our point of view. That's what we typically see in the industry and with our customers at the moment, is a lot of people do spreadsheets or some other method. And surprising thing, there are quite a lot of people who are not doing anything at this point in time. And that might be for various reasons. It hasn't been a requirement up to now. It's not a priority within your organisation, and we're not too surprised. So let's have a look at what we're talking about here. So one of the big things we see is there's so much happening around. Everyone talks about threats and findings and vulnerabilities in your organisation, and there's so much happening there. But you also got this need to be able to manage against compliance requirements, and that can be varied across the different industries. You could be meeting it to an ISO 27001, which is what we do within our cloud environment, our SaaS environments. It could be CCPA, it could be GDPR, HIPAA, PCI, NIST, FedRAMP. There might be various requirements that you have to meet. That could be regulatory, it could be an industry-based one, it could be a state or a country-based one. And you need to manage that against the other side of that, which is I've got people trying to hack into my systems, I've got findings, threats, vulnerabilities, and I need to remediate those. And how do I manage the ability to do both of those quickly and efficiently in a way that I can meet my compliance requirements, but I also want to make sure my data and systems are valid and safe? And what we find is most companies will invest heavily in the cyber threat detection. You know, they really spend a lot of money in setting up lots of tools to make sure they've got cyber threat protection in place, that detects something happening, they identify vulnerabilities. And yet, as we saw from our poll just now, most organisations continue to manage that compliance with manual spreadsheets. Or if they've got other tools, maybe they're outdated or they just operate within a certain silo. And what that means is that not only is doing that through a spreadsheet generally an inefficient approach, it can also leave your organisation vulnerable to a variety of risks because you're not picking those up, you're manually doing it, it might have been missed, or even just as bad for an organisation, regulatory penalties. So you could be hit with some penalty from an audit. So if the auditors come through and say, you haven't fixed this, you don't look like you're going to fix that, maybe there's a penalty that we need to apply to that. And those penalties can be quite severe. They can go into millions of dollars just because you haven't met that requirement. So as we mentioned earlier, that ability to be able to manage your threat and vulnerabilities, cybersecurity is key. And you can get the same things there, regulatory penalties, but also how do you manage that? And how do you do that in a more automated fashion? And that's where we start to look at what Avanti Neurons for Governance, Risk and Compliance can do for you. The core capabilities. It's built on top of the Avanti Neurons for ITSM platform. And why is that useful to you? Well, to start with, you've got that full integration across all the different solutions. Incident, problem, change, the CMDB and CIs, which are key to you. And if you do need to make change, you've got that flexibility to be able to do that without the need for developers. And then we start to manage we just start to do control mapping. So bringing in those regulatory capabilities. So looking at that authoritative document we have to bring in. What are the controls within there? What do we have to manage against from a regulatory side? How do I manage my risks? How do I go through a risk and risk assessment to make sure I understand what are the most important things to worry about and potentially what are the least important things I need to worry about? And automate those governance activities so that if I do get an auditor coming in, they say, how have you gone about fixing these particular controls? You've got that documented and it's in place, or there's exceptions. And then finally, having that visibility, looking at the visibility of what am I doing? How am I tracking? What hasn't been fixed? Where am I from that point? And all of that within the Avanti Neurons GRC capabilities we'll look at within the demonstration. But before we leap into the demonstration, we want to look at a couple of the background. How does it actually hang together? What are we looking at from this point of view? So what we're looking at is, let's look at the governance side. So we've got authoritative documents, and you might have one or more authoritative documents that you have to manage against. In this scenario, I've got ISO 27001 and I've got NIST. Within those authoritative documents that you put into place, you have citations. And citations are groups of controls. So citation could be user and access management, for example, or cryptology or encryption. And that would be your citation. So you've got that at a high level. And then within that, you've got controls. So for user and access management, it could be something like they have to do password resets every 90 days. Password length has to be 13 characters and various other things around user and access management. So those definitions are what you manage against. And then overlaying that will be these policies that overlay the top of that particular one. So we'll have a policy that sits on top of that particular requirement that says, okay, for my policy, user and access management, I might have controls that come out of NIST and ISO 27001. I might have encryption might come out with different controls that manage across NIST and ISO 27001. So I have different things that will manage across different areas of that organization. So that's your governance. So that's setting up what are the controls I need to manage, what are the controls I'm managing against, because not everything you might want to have from ISO 27001, for example, you want to manage against. It might not be relevant to your organization. So now let's go and look at the next stage of that, which is looking at our, and I'm having trouble moving forward. Let me just hang on a minute. There we go. So what are the risk and compliance side of things? So what else do we have within the solution? So risks. Within the risk side of things, we look at things like vulnerabilities, audits, a risk assessment could cause a risk to be created. And that's managing against risks that we have within our organization. But we can do risk assessments in there as well. So it could be on a building, an agreement, CI, your data processing server site vendor. So you want to understand all the risks you've got. And audits are another key aspect of that. And audits could be from a regulatory side of things. That's something I have to do once a year, for example, ISO 27001 or something like that. Or it could be a recurring one. I might do a recurring audit once a month for penetration testing or responding to threats or maybe checking my data center security. And from those, we have outcomes. And outcomes are, how do we plan to fix this if we have a finding? Or maybe there might be an exception out of that. So we're not actually going to fix this particular finding because maybe we're going to retire that system in a couple of days. We don't care about it, or it's a development system, or it doesn't have critical data. Our audit findings are key to that, and also we might be needed to provide evidence. You know, have you done this and how did you do it? And we've also included vendor onboarding. So vendor onboarding's bringing on a new vendor into our organisation. We want to go through some sort of risk assessment to understand, is there anything about this vendor that we should be concerned about? And if not, let's go and approve that vendor to be brought into our system. And that's another key aspect of the risk and compliance, is managing your vendors and understanding, are there concerns about any of those? So I've walked through the base of the solution, and we'll sort of look at the criteria. Let's jump into the demo and show you what that product looks like. Here we are within the GRC solution, and we're going to start by looking at our authoritative documents, our citations, and our controls and our policies. Within this particular environment, we've defined the authoritative documents that we're going to potentially measure certain citations against. We've got ISO 27001 defined, GDPR, PCI, HIPAA, NIST, CMMC, and then you can create your own authoritative document. An authoritative document really is just linking or talking about what is that we're going to align to. So starting with who owns that particular document, who the sponsors are, what document title, is it a standard or contractual obligation, regulatory statute, and then a description of that. And then we have our citations, and the citations are linked to that, and then any controls that are linked to citations will link back to that authoritative document. So we have that end-to-end view of what are we managing and what are we managing against. So when we look at citations, there'll be a lot of citations that come in, and really what you go through is a process of defining what citations are we going to measure against. So for example, if I say, let's just show me all the ones that don't require evidence at this particular point in time. And part of that might be I need to understand the management of removable media. And that might be a requirement that we have that demands that we have to track anything that's removable out to an endpoint. So we can link to that and say, look, we are actually going to have evidence that we manage that removable media. So we're going to say evidence is required. And is that linked to anything? Well, that's linked to ISO 27001. So we know that that's part of the process. Is it a legal requirement? Well, potentially it could be. It's also a business process, and maybe we have contractual reasons for doing that. And then we can create a new control, or we can link that to a control. If we want to link that to a control, we can then come through here and say secure disposal or reuse equipment is probably a relevant one for now. And is that linked to a policy of some sort? Well, again, we can link that to a policy if we want to have that linked into a particular policy. And we can look at all those particular, and that might be asset classification and control. So now we've defined that citation, and we're going to start to measure against that citation as to what we want to do. So that's a starting point for us. So we can start to go through that process of, we've got an authoritative document, we go through the process of defining our citations, and we link that to controls or create controls. And when we look at our controls, we can see what controls we currently have in place to manage that. And these might be encryption of passwords, secure disposal, and reuse of equipment. And if we do go into that, we should be able to see at any point in time what our citations are, what are we required to do, and is it linked to any policies that we might have. And we can see what policies we might have in there. And then we have our policies. And policies are something you define. So a policy can go across multiple different control citations, authoritative documents. So for example, access control. We can look at our access control policies. What do we have in there? What are our policy documents? What controls do we have? Who's approved that? And how do we manage against that? So these are the definitions that we work against and how we manage that from the point of view of, let's define our overall authoritative documents, link that to our citations, our controls, and our policies. So now we have a clear view of what information is out there and what are we managing against. So now let's look at this from the point of view of risks and risk assessments. So risks are obviously a key factor in managing anything to do with governance, risk and compliance. The governance piece we looked at, they're authoritative documents. They're our controls, our citations, our policies. And then risks is how do we manage to that? So how do we go about managing risks? And we can have a dashboards that indicate what the risks are, what's in progress, any that I might be working on, and what is the impact or likelihood. So we can start to look at that. So we can look at, there's different risks that we might have defined. And then we have, is there anything that's looking at expiring from that point of view, and do we need to clean that up? So what do we have from a risk side? So we can look at our different risks, and we can start to manage across those risks and looking at what do we need to do to manage those particular risks. And it might be, to start with, we might have a database security leak, data leak. So we can look at that particular risk, and it's defined as, how do we come about getting that risk? And a risk is defined from, what did we do to identify it? It could have been from an audit. We'll talk about audits in a little while. It can be just a manual. We could have identified this risk as part of our risk assessment, or it could be from a vulnerability scan. Once we've defined that risk, we can then go through, what is that linkage to? So it's potentially caused by breaches of information, asset destruction. It could be a third party, so we've got someone trying to attack our systems. Is it linked to any controls that might be in there from a control point of view? What assets does it impact? And in this particular case, being a SQL injection, we'd link that to our assets as to what are the most likely. And then we can go about saying, okay, are we going to do anything from a risk assessment? And the risk assessment is going to link to, what do we define as the potential of this? So do we need to worry about it? So is it something that's a concern to us, or is it unlikely and we don't care about it? And then we can have, or link it to policies and audits. So let's have a look at a little bit more about that risk assessment and what we need to do to look at that. So when we look at risk assessments, and we can say our critical server authorized access, which was the risk assessment we had linked to that. Let's drill into that. So the first thing we define is, what sort of risk assessment? Now, a risk assessment can be a vendor, a building, a site, a CI, a service. You define what that risk assessment type is. And if it's doing it from a CI point of view, we then go through the process of saying, well, what are the assets that are potentially part of that risk assessment? And then we look at that from, we ask two types of questions. We look at it from a threat analysis, and we look at it from a risk mitigation. And we supply sample questions there to identify or look at information or questions that you might ask. So, does the function of business service depend on outside resources? What's the impact of that? So is it a high impact or no impact? And what's the impact level? So we could say the impact level for that is medium, so we'll adjust that. Does it depend on specialized technology? Maybe there's no impact, so we can specify no impact for that one. And you go through and answer the questions based on the criteria that you've defined for that particular question. Cost of recovery from a security incident, and we can say that might be high. So I've defined that and set out our threat analysis. And then we go through the process of doing that for a risk mitigation. Now, for risk mitigation, similar type concept, except we define, is there protection at the origin? We can say it's moderate, strong, and our data retention is strong. So we define those criteria, we've set that, and what we get is our unmitigated risk and our mitigated risk. So we have medium and low risks assigned to that. So now that we've completed that, we then need to make decisions of, what do we do? So we've linked that to our original risk. We have our risk mitigations. What do we plan to do outside of this? And there's two concepts that we could go with. The first is, we could say, well, we're going to put an exception in place. And what is that exception? Well, we can say, we're going to look at that exception. We're going to put an exception in there to say, we're not actually going to fix this issue. It's a temporary project, does not contain any customer employee data. So we're saying we're going to put that as an exception. We don't need to worry about it. There's no concerns with us for that particular risk. But it could also be that we need to go through a mitigation plan. And that mitigation plan you could put at the risk assessment level, or we could do that mitigation plan at the risk level. In this particular case, we do have a mitigation plan at the risk database level. So the mitigation plan is, we're going to restrict database access, and we're going to put in place a task in there that's going to say, right, we're going to patch the SQL Server, and it's been assigned to a particular individual. That means we've got one incomplete task that has to be completed by a certain time, what the status is, what's currently working on it. So we can change the status, say look, it's in progress, and we're still working on that particular mitigation plan. That particular user would have that task allocated to them. So they would work to resolving that task to patch the SQL Server. And that then gives us a record of all the things that have happened. We created the risk, we identified it as a risk, we've done a risk assessment of that. We either put in place an exception or a mitigation plan, and if it's a mitigation plan, we have a task in play as to who's doing that work and when are they going to complete that work. So that's our role of risks, and we can track the risks within our risk system. We can start to look at, what are the risks available? Do I have any? Are there any risks out there? And we can also look at how is our compliance. So we've got any risk assessments that might be in play. We can also look at any incomplete risk assessments and our threat analysis that we have. Now let's have a look at audits. So audits is the other part of that. And out of audits, you can get risks. So we're going to come into here and look at our audits. Now audits can be due to ISO 27001, for example. I can look at an audit calendar and I can see I've got a yearly audit that is related to ISO 27001. We have a regular penetration testing occurring, and we might have another one which is to access our physical access controls. Now if I drill into my yearly audit, what we will see out of that is the details of the audit, the description, the scope and the criteria, how often we do that. And from that audit we would then have, is it linked to assets, what participants are involved, but we get the audit findings. And what do we find out of those audit findings? Is there anything in that audit that we need to respond to? So do we have to put in place a mitigation plan? If we do need to put in a mitigation plan, we can then put my mitigation plan into play, and we can create a mitigation plan and link that. But we may also be required to bring in evidence. So we need evidence of it's internal, might be a document. We need to create a security procedures document and provide that. And that will enable us to pass that particular audit. And we can track our audits all the way through, and again we have our audits here that we can track at that level. And overall we have these dashboards that give us visibility of any audits might be occurring, any related risks to audits, what they are by priority, and any open tasks that we might have against those audits. And we can also look at our citations and controls and see how we're tracking at that level. So the final part I want to look at is our vendor assessments, or our vendor risk management capabilities. So let's go and look at that and how that works into our overall GRC solution. So our vendor risk assessment is about onboarding a new vendor. So we want to understand all the risks involved with that vendor. So from within our self-service IT portal, we can have a vendor onboarding form where we can enter the relevant information of what vendor we're onboarding. So that might be we want to onboard, let's say it's soft.com. I'm going to be the primary contact name, and then what sort of vendor are they? So it could be a consultant, so we might be bringing in a contractor, it might be a service, it might be a product. We're going to say it's a services. Vendor category is a product and a SaaS provider. It's going to be a subscription license. We are going to host that, so it's going to be online. Are the internal software or data the vendor will have access to? We can say internal user IDs, integration to Salesforce. Will they have access to the physical site? We might say no. Might they store anything? We might say, okay, they might. Do we have anything else? And then we can attach NDAs, etc. Now once we've done that, we then submit that form. So the vendor onboarding form gets submitted, and it comes in as a IT service request, and then we can see the details we put in there. So this is all the data we entered as part of that vendor request, and then it will go through a process of linking or creating a vendor record that we need to go through some sort of process to assess the risks of that vendor. So that vendor request will actually come through to our GRC manager, and we can see that soft.com record, which is here, that we created, and it's on hold as it currently stands. So what we have here is a record. So this is the record that we created. The soft.com was what we created, and we brought across relevant information that's related to that vendor. Now we can go through the process of assessing that vendor, and we can go into here. It's linked to our service request that we did, and we can go in and say we're going to do a risk assessment of this particular vendor, and we can create that record. Assessment of soft.com, allocate that to a team, and we define the assessment type. In this particular case, it's going to be a vendor risk assessment. We save that, and if we go to that particular record, we can then go through the risk assessment for that vendor type. We've got the vendor that we link to, and then we go through and answer we answer the questions relevant to a vendor risk assessment. Once we've determined that the vendor is acceptable, we can put them onto a good standing, and then that record would then have that vendor as someone we could move forward with. So that's how we manage our vendor assessments across the board. And as we've already looked at, we have complete visibility of our GRC. So we can look at it across citations, our audits, and at any time we can look at audit information, our controls, and understanding what controls we have in place, what's currently open, what policies may be needing to be reviewed, our mitigation plans, which is important to understand how we're tracking from a mitigation plan, who's working on them, and when are they going to be finished. Our risk assessment and compliance of how we're tracking, and finally, any risks that we might have. I hope this demo has been useful for you and that you have a better understanding of the GRC solution. Right, so we've had a look at the demo. I hope that's been useful to you. And what are the benefits of a GRC tool? Yeah, it's governance, ensuring you meet your organisational goals and processes, managing your risks across everything you've got, identifying, mitigating, monitoring, and your compliance. So back to that regulatory compliance. And it gives you the ability to manage across your entire organisation, very much more around that IT side of things. So let's have a look and see if there are any questions that we have that people want to answer before we wrap up in a couple of minutes. So there's a couple of questions in there I see in the thread. Can I import any authoritative document? Yes, you can. I mean, we're importing that currently via spreadsheets. So we've got authoritative information within a spreadsheet that you have, and it could be an internal document that you've currently used. It could be a regulatory one that you've downloaded. You can import those documents. But we are looking at extending that in next year. The ability to import or integrate with UCS, which is a unified compliance framework. And the UCF compliance framework has that capability it has a lot of these standardized documents, authoritative documents that you can import. So we want to simplify that process of getting those authoritative documents into the system. And the final question we've got is, can I perform a risk assessment as a result of an incident or vulnerability? Yes, you can. So if an incident comes in, and it might be a security incident, it might be an incident that you're concerned about, you can run a risk assessment off that. So create the risk assessment off the incident, run through that risk assessment, and then it becomes part of that the GRC solution or GRC capabilities across the board. So I don't think there's any other questions that we have in the queue. We're sort of at the 30-minute mark. So thank you very much for attending the session. We hope that was useful to you in understanding what GRC does have for you. There are other resources available. We do have a detailed demo that covers the content again in a bit more depth, and you will get the recording in the next few days through email. So thank you very much for attending today.